Today to speak in opposition to H.R. 810, the Stem Cell Research Enhancement Act. First of all, Mr. President, I join with everyone in the United States Senate, in fact, everyone around the country, in saying that, of course, we want to further research and opportunity for the cure and the treatment of very serious illnesses. Of course, we want to do everything possible within a strong ethical framework to push forward that scientific research and that progress. But at least I want to do that, Mr. President, in, as I said, a clear, certain ethical framework. And that's why I must oppose the details of the provisions of H.R. 810. Mr. President, I oppose it on two significant grounds. First of all, because, Mr. President, one of my solemn duties in the Senate, I believe, is to protect and defend all human life, every case of human life, the beauty, the sanctity, the importance of the individual, which God has created. And secondly, Mr. President, I do this in particular focusing on the fact that we're talking by definition on the use of taxpayer dollars here. We're not merely talking about what is allowed, what is disallowed. We're talking about the use of taxpayer dollars for specific purposes when some of these types of research are so utterly controversial in terms of its impact on individual human lives. Mr. President, a human embryo is a human life. I believe that to the core of my being. It's at the initial stages of life and development, of course, but an embryo is a human life. Each and every one of us began as an embryo. And therefore, Mr. President, I firmly believe neither Congress nor independent researchers nor any human being, for that matter, should be allowed to, in effect, play God by determining that one life is inherently more valuable than another, determining that one life should essentially be sacrificed for some other purpose to advance the welfare of other separate human lives. Now, of course, supporters of embryonic stem cell research argue that this research only kills embryos that would be discarded anyway. But, Mr. President, there are many cases that prove otherwise, where embryos have been adopted while still embryos or donated to infertile couples by their parents. We know, Mr. President, that as many as 99 families have adopted and given birth to children from those very same frozen embryos. These kids are often referred to as snowflake babies. They're beautiful, they're miracles. They remind us that, of course, we are talking here about human life. So how can we justify killing these tiny little humans by saying that these embryos would be discarded anyway, when there is proof that in some cases they are not discarded, they are adopted, they have been adopted, they grow up to be full, mature, healthy children, human beings? Supporters of embryonic stem cell research argue that this research is essential to curing many diseases and that federally funding it is our only hope for curing diseases. But I point out, Mr. President, that there are many other alternatives to this, and in fact, those alternatives are more promising in many ways than the type of research we're debating here today. The facts show that adult stem cells have been used to perform at least 69 successful treatments for human patients. 69 treatments on human patients, direct human clinical application, successful application. What is the experience in terms of embryonic stem cells? Well, 0 successful treatments in human patients, 0 direct clinical application. 25 years of this research, still no direct human clinical trials, and many stops and starts and complications with regard to other research in mice. The following are some disorders and diseases with treatments from adult stem cells that are worth noting: brain cancer, testicular cancer, ovarian cancer, skin cancer, acute heart damage, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, spinal cord injury, stroke damage, Parkinson's disease, chronic liver failure, sickle cell anemia, end-stage bladder disease. Again, not just promising but successful in many cases human clinical trials directly focused on these very serious diseases. So, Mr. President, if one weighs all of these factors in the balance, I truly believe that the thing to do is to respect all human life, to respect the very heartfelt feelings of millions upon millions, tens of millions of Americans who have fundamental problems with this sort of research. And again, it's worth underscoring, we're not debating whether this research can happen. We're debating if we're going to use taxpayer dollars to fund it, if we're going to forcibly take money from those Americans who, like me, have fundamental moral reservations with the research and spend it on that very research. I'm happy to say, Mr. President, that there's other legislation that we are considering today, and I strongly support those two other bills. First of all, the Fetus Farming Prohibition Act, S. 3504, which prohibits the creation and gestation of human beings for the purpose of harvesting spare organs, body parts, and tissue. You know, Mr. President, many people think fetus farming sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, and it does. But it's already being explored in animals. This is something that's advancing scientifically. Congress must prevent science from subjecting human beings to organ, body part, and tissue harvesting before it's too late. And the second bill, which I proudly support today, Mr. President, is the Alternative Pluripotent Stem Cell Therapies Enhancement Act, S. 2754. It requires that the National Institute of Health support research into alternative methods other than destroying human embryos of creating pluripotent stem cells. These stem cells are valuable for treating diseases because they are capable of forming most or all of the tissues of the adult body. So again, this would forge a new path to make sure we explore other avenues to create these stem cells that do not involve the destruction of precious embryos, human beings, human life. I believe this alternative path, Mr. President, is far more productive. And I believe it's far more in keeping with upholding the values of our society, the very strongly held belief of tens of millions of Americans who, like I, have fundamental moral reservations with the destruction of individual human life for these other purposes. And so, Mr. President, I urge all of our Senate colleagues to join me and others in supporting those two bills about ethical alternatives, but in opposing this underlying bill, H.R. 810, because it would involve the destruction of individual precious embryos, human life. Again, Mr. President, I don't come to this conclusion quickly or easily or rashly. Like virtually every American family, mine has been touched by very serious diseases on which this research pertains. My dad had Parkinson's disease. He suffered with it for about 8 years. It was very debilitating, and of course, eventually, like most folks with Parkinson's disease, he passed from that and complications of it. Of course, with that personal history, I want to advance research in every ethical way possible. But we must do it, again, in a strong moral framework. We must do it within clear, reasonable bounds, particularly when we're talking about taxpayer funding of research. I believe defeating H.R. 810, but also passing the two bills which set up alternative paths toward promising research is that correct way to proceed, and I urge all of my colleagues, Mr. President, to join me in adopting that path. Mr. President, with that, I yield back my